Federalist 45, Part 3, we'll start with paragraph 7, and Madison continues with his list of powers that are retained by the state governments, and they're not threatened by the federal government. Just because federal government got some powers exclusively assigned to it, it doesn't mean state governments are going to lose a lot of their power. The state governments may be regarded as constituent and essential parts of the federal government, whilst the latter is nowise essential to the operation or organization of the former. Without the intervention of the state legislatures, the President of the United States cannot be elected at all. We talked a little bit about this in 44 or 43 in short paragraph. So he says, look, the president, when the president gets elected, it's by electoral college votes. And those electoral college votes, those electoral votes are directly or indirectly controlled by state legislatures. So you guys have so much power in even electing the president. They must in all cases have a great share in his appointment and will perhaps in most cases of themselves determine it. The Senate will be elected absolutely and exclusively by the state legislatures. The senators are going to be very powerful in this federal government. They are going to be directly elected by you state legislatures. Now remember, it wasn't until 19 teens that the amendment was added to the Constitution that the election of senators be directly by the population, by the people. Even the House of Representatives, though drawn immediately from the people, will be chosen very much under the influence of that class of men whose influence over the people obtains for themselves an election into the state legislatures. So even the members of the House of Representatives that are elected every 2 years, even those people, if they are not in good standing in the states with state legislators and stuff, they are usually not going to be up for election. Even at that stage, you guys can somehow block things from happening if you don't want a certain representative to be elected. Thus, each of the principal branches of the federal government will owe its existence more or less to the favor of the state governments, and must consequently feel a dependence which is more likely to beget a disposition too obsequious than too overbearing towards them. On the other side, the component parts of the state governments will in no instance be indebted for their appointment to the direct agency of the federal government, and very little, if at all, to the local influence of its members. Notice here he said, thus each of the principal branches of the federal government will owe its existence more or less to the favor of the state governments. In the paragraph that I read, we talked about the senators, the president being the executive department, the senators and the members of the House of Representatives, they are the legislative branch, but he didn't say anything about judges. So how can he say every branch has been affected, touched by what, or can be touched and directed and influenced by the states? Well, all the federal judges are going to be nominated by the president, but they will not become a judge unless the senators give consent to it. So see, that's why he didn't even have to say it, because you can't elect a federal judge without Senate okaying it, and the state legislatures elect the senators, so that's how they can control the judiciary. Then the next paragraph, the number of individuals employed under the Constitution of the United States will be much smaller than the number employed under the particular states. Okay, this whole paragraph is going to talk about federal government is not going to have a huge bureaucracy. At the time, you're saying there's only going to be a few people that on a daily basis you'll be dealing with it. Most of the people that you'll be dealing with are the people who are elected at the state level, directly or indirectly. So he'll go down through this list, whether it has to do with collecting taxes, whether it has to do with whatever. It says the number of federal government workers are going to be much fewer than the state government people that you'll elect and you'll be daily in contact with, or maybe weekly in contact with. So he's in a way, he's trying to say federal government will not be all over the place. I know things have changed now, but remember, we're talking about Federalist Papers, and the Federalist Papers are defending the Constitution before the amendments were added. Okay, just constantly remind yourself of that. All right. I'll continue. There will consequently be less of a personal influence on the side of the former than of the latter. In other words, personal influence of the federal government would be much smaller than the state governments. The members of the legislative, executive, the judiciary departments of 13 and more states, these are states that are going to eventually be joining these 13. These are territories, and we already know, we've talked about that there are going to be states that are going to be created out of this area. That's the blue area up here and up here. And these new states are going to be added. That's why it says 13 and more states. The justices of peace, officers of militia, ministerial officers of justice, with all the county, corporation, and town officers for 3 million and more people, for 3 million and more of people intermixed and having particular acquaintance with every class and circle of people must exceed beyond all proportion, both in numbers and influence, those of every description who will be employed in the administration of the federal system. Okay, let me reread this. I totally ruined it. So he says, when all these new members, new states are created and population becomes more, this is what's going to happen. Both in number and influence, those of every description who will be employed in the administration of the federal system. Compare the members of the 3 great departments of the 13 states, excluding from the Judiciary Department the justices of peace, with the members of the corresponding departments of the single government of the Union. Compare the militia officers of 3 millions of people with the military and marine officers of any establishment which is within the compass of probability, or I may add, of possibility. And in this view alone, we might pronounce the advantage of the states to be decisive. If the federal government is to have collectors of revenue, the state governments will have theirs also. And as those of the former will be principally on the seacoast and not very numerous, whilst those of the latter will be spread over the face of the country and will be very numerous. And the advantage in this view also lies on the same side. When he says those of the federal government will be on the seacoast, look, as we have already talked about it, he says majority of the revenue for federal government will come from impost taxes, taxes on imports. That's why he says most of our tax collectors for the federal government will be here along the Atlantic seacoast to levy taxes or gather taxes, collect taxes from the ships that come in with cargoes. So I'll continue with the next sentence. It is true that the Confederacy is to possess and may exercise the power of collecting internal as well as external taxes throughout the states. But it is probable that this power will not be resorted to except supplemental purposes of revenue. It says, remember, for the most part, most of the revenue for the federal government will come from import taxes. But in this new constitution, we have added that direct taxes of people, but that's going to happen only when there is an emergency. So till that emergency happens, most of our tax collectors are going to be on the seacoast. That an option will be then given to the states to supply their quotas by previous collections of their own, and that the eventual collection under the immediate authority of the Union will generally be made by the officers and according to the rules appointed by the several states. Indeed, it is extremely probable that in other instances, particularly in the organization of the judicial power, the officers of the states will be clothed with correspondent authority of the Union. Should it happen, however, that separate collectors of internal revenue should be appointed under the federal government, the influence of the whole number would not bear a comparison with that of the multitude of the state officers in the opposite scale. Within every district to which a federal collector would be allotted, there would not be less than 30 or 40 or even more officers of different descriptions, and many of them persons of character and weight whose influence would lie on the side of the state. It says any way you look at it, you're going to be in contact, in touch with more of your state officials than federal officials. So states are going to be there, they're going to be very important, and don't be afraid, because no concentration of power is going to happen.